In this episode of FieldLink, we dive into the details of data. Joining us will be Gary Grimm. He's a Agri-Intelligence Services Manager from Iowa, and he's going to share some insight with us as we evaluate the 22 yields and begin to make plans for the 23 growing season. Then we'll travel to Nashville for a commodity market update with Jody Lawrence with Strategic Trading Advisors. Then we're off to the West Coast to visit with Paul Crout in California to learn a little bit more about the grape industry and how the demand for wine grapes has impacted the way growers in that region depend on strategic partners and products from Helena. Stay tuned for FieldLink. In many cases, growers love the thrill of watching the yield monitor go up and down through the sections of the field. It's often an entertaining way to break up long days of harvest or to simply have bragging rights at the coffee shop about the top-end yields with their family and friends, or even suppliers from time to time. While other growers rely on the data to help them make more detailed production decisions, no matter where growers land in this spectrum, producers across the nation have been capturing yield data on flash drives and other devices for many years. In many cases, because there's so much data, they simply don't know where to turn. That's where the experts from Helena AGRIntelligence team comes in. Joining us today is Gary Grimm from Des Moines, Iowa. Gary is an Agri-Intelligence Services Manager from Iowa. He manages the agri-intelligence business across the upper Midwest. And Gary, welcome to FieldLink.
Bill, thanks for the invite and good to be here.
Hey, we were really excited to catch up with you again, Gary. Gary, before we deep dive into agri-intelligence and the world of data and yield management, can you give us a little bit about you? Tell us about your story.
Sure, absolutely. So, grew up in Iowa, eastern Iowa. My brother still farms there today. I went to Iowa State, graduated in 1990. Went to work out of Iowa State, went to Eastern Illinois, spent some time in retail with FS there for 3 years, and then had an opportunity in 93 when precision ag was really just getting its start. And we had an opportunity with a local grower there where I was working at a different company and installed a yield monitor. And from there, my career in precision ag was born, I guess. When I went to Iowa State, there wasn't any classes that really allowed me to explore it. So I'm from a school of hard knocks, or learn as you go, I guess, with precision ag, and I've seen a lot of changes. So spent 11 years in Illinois, in the eastern side of Illinois, and then had an opportunity to come work for Helena. And I've been with Helena since 2001, so it's starting in my 22nd year. So it's been a good deal. And all through Helena's career, I've been in precision ag. So
Wow.
Most of my time has been in the precision ag world.
So you're one of those people that truly was on the pioneering edge of precision agriculture.
You could say that, yeah. Bleeding edge, whatever you want to call it, right?
Well, we've definitely come a long way over the many years since you got involved with precision agriculture. And you know, Gary, for many years, growers have been collecting yield information with their combines. How have growers, I guess, generally been utilizing this information over the years?
Yeah, so it's changed. When I first got into it, obviously, it was we didn't have the displays that we have today and all the ability to capture that information like we did. But nonetheless, throughout the years, you've noticed that guys have gotten better over time. Mm-hmm. But quite honestly, a guy will print out a yield map, look at it, and say, okay, I can see where the good areas are and bad areas are in the field. So it's been more of a visual observation, and I'm not saying that's across the board, but a lot of times people get kind of locked up and just don't know what to do with it. They got mountains of data, but what do they do with it? So that's always been a challenge, one that we've tried to break down here at Helena. So I think we're doing a much better job today. I think growers in general are doing a much better job of utilizing the information and trying to make sense of it. But still, there's some barriers. There's some challenges that are still out there. But as software gets better, as the industry develops better tools to help analyze data, as computers get more powerful to crunch mountains of data. We hear the term big data. That's where we're at today, trying to capture all of the information, make sense of the information, and then make management decisions from that information. So it's changed, Bill, over the years, but I think again, we're getting better with that, with the tools.
Yeah, it's definitely evolving over the years, and I can remember, Gary, when you and I worked together for a long time. But there were many growers that had these awesome data collection tools in their John Deere tractors and combines. Didn't really know what they were doing with it. They had several years of data sitting on a flash drive, and it's really beginning to evolve.
That's right. It is. It's really guys know how to use it. They're plugging in their hybrids as they plant. They're watching those hybrids change across the field when they're harvesting. So they're, the visual aspect of it's huge. And being able to, as you drive through the field in the combine, and they start making decisions right there in the cab. And that's the neat thing about that. But to dig further into it, you've got to have the tools, you've got to have the knowledge of what you're looking at and being able to decipher what the data is telling you. And again, we've spent a lot of time here at Helena trying to make that happen, trying to find the relationships between, the data, the planting information, the fertility information, all of the things that a farmer's doing across the field impacts yield, whether they know it or not. Mm-hmm. It's our job to uncover that, use it to its fullest potential. If we're not using the data to its fullest potential, shame on us. We have to be helping farmers do that and accomplish that task.
So Gary, True Yield. True Yield is Helena's solution for interpreting yield information. How is that True Yield platform different from, I guess, others that are out there on the market?
Sure. So we've been Helena's been developing and has developed their own platform, and within our AI 360 software, we've been developing the tools in a systematic approach, an agronomic first systematic approach for precision ag, and we think it's unique. And True Yield itself is one of the hubs in the wheel, or the cogs in the wheel, if you will, that it's the report card at the end of the year. And it's different in the fact that yes, it tells you what the yield was, but it's only the beginning for the next season. We're able to take that information in our True Yield platform and start making sense of it. It's doing yield by analysis against nutrients, or by planting date, by hybrid. So all of the things that the customer is doing, we're able to take that into AI 360 and make a lot of sense of it and put it to use for the customer.
So really, True Yield is essentially a report card of all of the activities that have really kind of taken place in that field for the previous year or so. Is that pretty accurate?
That's absolutely. It is a yield map. Let's not mistake that.
Okay.
It is a yield map, and it is a pretty picture, but a picture speaks 1,000 words. And in yield data, that is what we're after, is the words behind the picture. What story is it telling us? Can we leverage that yield map to make a management decision, to tweak a fertility application, to tweak a planting rate? Those are the things that we have to look for, and we incorporate all the agronomics into it. Soil testing. We take tissue analysis through our extractor program, and we then fine tune next year's plan to meet what we learn from that yield map. Yes, it's history, and we can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but history is able to allow us to make some predictions, to make some changes in the way that we're farming for the better to increase yield. If we don't increase yield, we shouldn't be doing this at all. So that's what our objective is.
You bring up a really good point here where, if I understand this correctly, True Yield actually is a piece of the Agri-Intelligence platform, but it has been specifically developed to work very closely with our high ground program and our extractor program, or high ground being our soil testing capabilities, as well as extractor, our tissue sampling capabilities, but bringing all of that information under to, I guess, really one roof. Is that how that's staged up?
Absolutely. In a lot of cases, growers are have their yield data in a platform, and they can look at the yield data and perhaps the planting information, the hybrid information. But I think what we can do with that in our platform, when we move that over out of another system into AI 360, we're able to incorporate our fertility information, our planting prescriptions, our tissue analysis, our scouting data, all of the things that we're capturing during the year. We're able then to look back and say, okay, how was yield impacted from all of those decisions that we made? So, and again, I think I mentioned it earlier, but we consider that a systematic approach. And we start with a complete soil test, and we move throughout the growing season by making a specific ask recommendation, our fertility program. We do seed strong recommendations. So we're able to make that in an entire season-long plan, precision data gathering system throughout the year. So I think it's unique in that way, that we're able to bring everything under one house, make sense of it, and produce a recommendation and the final outcome at the end of the year.
So Gary, tell me, as I understand it, True Yield, a grower, it doesn't matter what color of equipment they have. You have the capability at Helena to really grab the majority of that information and work with different pieces of equipment. Is that pretty accurate?
Absolutely. We do not. We're colorblind. We don't. We can work with any system. So John Deere, Case, Ag Leader, it doesn't matter. As long as you're capturing the information, as long as you're doing a good job of calibrating the information, and we can use it. We can put it to use. We can bring it into AI 360 and run the analysis that we were just talking about earlier in that system. So yes, it doesn't matter to us.
You referenced AI 360, and for a lot of our listeners, they're probably not familiar with that platform, but that's Helena's proprietary platform for information. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. So we put a lot of work, a lot of effort, resources into developing our own system in-house. That we have built this system for ag retail to help import the information, get the information under one roof, and then be able to look across fertility, planting data, tissue data, all of the things that we're capturing, and then make recommendations from there and make sense of the data. So we're proud of what we have. We believe it's a comprehensive system. Does it do everything 100%? I won't sit here and make that claim, but we do believe it does a lot of what we need to do to help the grower understand and interpret the information.
Gary, obviously being from Iowa, I'm assuming True Yield works really well for corn and soybeans and some other row crops, but can it work for other crops, I guess, beyond the typical Midwest?
Yeah. Obviously, I'm a corn and soybeans guy, but absolutely cotton data, wheat data, anything that is able to capture yield data through the common the platforms, we're able to utilize that information. So, but yes, it certainly will work in other areas.
Gary, there seems to be a lot of information here. What steps has Helena implemented to make the transition of all of this information and knowledge a little easier for growers?
Yeah. So We believe Helena is a little bit different in how we support agri-intelligence. We have a lot of folks that are devoted in our company to precision ag. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but close to 200 people across the country that are devoted. They wake up every day thinking about precision ag, thinking about the information, and thinking about agri-intelligence. That's their job day to day. So you can gather the information. Everybody can collect the information. But if you don't have the people in your organization to help support and understand what the information is telling you, then you're not getting the most out of it. So we have people, boots on the ground, that will help the customer look at the data, interpret the data, make sense of the data, and try to sift through. There's things that people will see or think they see in the information, but unless you dig deeper, unless you understand 100% what you're looking for, you could make a wrong decision. So that's where we're proud of our folks at our locations. We have a lot of folks that are at our locations that are able to do just that. So I think that's what helps us and helps our customers make the most of agri-intelligence and the information that we're gathering.
I think you bring up a really great point here that often gets overlooked. There's a lot of, I'm going to call them Silicon Valley type companies that have really come into this space in agriculture over the last several years, but you simply can't do everything, online. You do need those local boots on the ground to really do what you just said, Gary. Help that grower interpret and ask questions back and forth and really dig through the data to make sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, that's just the start. Printing out a map, looking at it on the kitchen table. If you don't have a strong, knowledgeable individual that knows what they're looking for, you could make some bad assumptions or bad decisions that could impact the next growing season. So that's where we try to differentiate ourselves is our people. We've got great tools. We've got great products to go along with that to make recommendations. But we have to be able to understand what we're looking at.
Gary, if a grower's interested, how do they get started? Do they need any special hardware or tools? What's the process?
I think the most obvious, is we're talking about true yield today, having a yield monitor in the cab. If you're not collecting the information or don't know how to collect the information or what buttons to push, that's where our people come in too, able to help, not necessarily install it, but walk through some of the beginning steps if you're not familiar with that. So, that would be the biggest starting point for that, Bill. But I think the other thing that most people are somewhat getting into is variable rate seeding, having the capability of doing that. So taking it to the next level, so you can compare yield to population or yield to variety, or yield to planting date. Those types of things will go a long way for that. But I think it's important to have that first starting point and just capture the yield data and put it to use.
And if a grower out there wants to get started, they just simply need to reach out to their Helena representative. And now's a great time to get started as we get ready for fall harvest.
Absolutely. Start, are you ready? Is it, obviously can't do calibrations, but is everything in place? You can make sure that everything's plugged in and working and ready to go. So our folks can help do that. So it is not too early to start thinking about that today. Harvest, it's right around the corner.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think some producers might think, I have to wait for spring planting for me to get started. But in reality, capturing that data this year, this fall, is a good starting point to help begin the process to make better production decisions for the 23 crop.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about yield history. We can do things with 1 year of yield, but if you have more than 1 year, that's where we start to really shine and start to make sense. So that yield history is very important when we're looking at making seeding recommendations. That's a big thing, and making sense of yield history of, where's your high producing areas, where your low producing areas year after year. Yeah, weather makes a huge impact on that, but we can see other things with that. So normalizing yield data is another thing that we do, and put it to use, and using the yield information, making fertility recommendations. Use the actual removal is another thing that we can do. So there's a lot of things that we can start to help with there, I guess, when we're collecting yield data in our true yield system.
Well, Gary, I want to thank you for joining us here today. And as growers are listening, boy, now is a great time to have that conversation with your Helena representative to learn more about True Yield and the entire Agri-Intelligence platform. And Gary, thank you for helping us navigate this big world of data and learn more about the True Yield program from the Agri-Intelligence team.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and great to talk with you.
Now joining us from Nashville is Jody Lawrence for a commodity update. Jody, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate you having me on again.
Well, Jody, this past weekend we started off with some pretty good news. Looked like we might have a deal in Russia and the Ukraine, agreeing to some peace deals to let some grain kind of move out of the ports over there. Then, it wasn't even 20 hours later, they changed their mind and start to shoot bombs over into the Ukraine and change the game a little bit. Jody, how did the market respond to that this morning?
It opened sharply higher, and corn and beans were able to hold on to the gains, and wheat at one point was trading, which I think is going to be the more sensitive between corn and wheat. Wheat's going to be the more sensitive in all the Ukraine-Russia news, simply because of the stockpiles that the rest of the world needs, a starving North Africa and Middle East, basically. And but wheat finished 24 off the highs, and that, wheat just can't seem, either the people trading it won't want to believe Russia to a point, or there is just an anchor down here that just believes that at some point there's even, another rug to be pulled out. I'm not sure what that would be, but wheat not holding its gains, but corn and beans for the first Monday in about 3 or 4 weeks to be able to finish the day much closer to the highs tells me that those two are being controlled by the U.S. weather as much as anything, while wheat is simply at the mercy of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and if those exports start to go out. And yeah, you mentioned, just simply from a human kindness and, concern for our fellow, our well-being of our fellow, the Ukraine, or everybody. The Ukrainians need the money, and then everybody in Africa. But all news like that cuts into U.S. demand. So good humanitarian news is not necessarily bullish price news, and that's been a part of it for the last month.
Yeah, there's just a lot of uncertainty still in that particular market, and it feels like a lot of the traders just simply aren't buying into that narrative right now, and creating a lot of up and downs in that particular market. But to your point on the corn and beans finishing on a high note, certainly reacting, it feels like anyhow, Jody, to the weather. Boy, we've had, right in the middle of a heat wave here across much of the United States, and during a critical time. How's the weather, really impacting some of these prices from your perspective?
Well, it has the issue really for the last 6 weeks. Let's just call it back to about the first week of June. There was a very late planted crop. It was cool and wet in the spring, and we immediately shifted from the acreage report back in March to, gosh, are we going to be able to get in all of these acres, because Mother Nature did not provide anybody with a particularly good spring. It was too wet, too cool, or too cold, and it just dragged on forever. And then all of a sudden we went from, okay, we had about a good 10-day, 2-week window. The crop got planted. And then all of a sudden, all this scorching heat that's been around for most of the summer and plaguing the western corn belt and the Southern Plains, the wheat belt down there, and us being both located in Tennessee, the Delta and the Southeast have been just scorched all summer. I think Tennessee, either Memphis and Nashville, had 23 straight days of 90 or higher, and half of those days heat index was over 100. And it's hard to grow corn, high yield corn at least, when it's like that. And then really, because today's crop conditions came out and corn dropped a couple more percent and beans dropped a couple more percent, and they're both under 60%, which the market is not really buying into what the crop condition reports are telling us, because crop condition reports would tell us that corn, obviously, if it finishes well, August weather trumps everything I'm about to say. That sure. If the corn yield comes in at 174 and bean yield comes in at 50, prices are going to have to go substantially higher, because you're going to draw down stocks in the U.S. and just working its way down the list through the rest of the world, because Europe's in a dire drought situation. Argentina's wheat crop's getting chewed to pieces because of their hot, dry La Nina pattern. The only country that's producing what seems to be a trend or better crop is Russia, saying that their wheat crop is enormous. And all of a sudden we go back to, okay, we're going to believe Russia, and they tell us that their wheat crop is enormous. So it's what the Russia ag minister is telling us is, as opposed to what the USDA and WASI are telling us, you're talking about a 400 to 500 million bushel difference between the USDA and the Russian, the latest out of their ag department. So just weird times to try to predict anything and look into the crystal ball, because it's still mine's just still as cloudy as it was a month ago, and then 6 months ago with all the geopolitical events, world economic events. When you start talking about fears of a recession and the other things going on, but the hot, dry weather, if it comes back and we have a poor finish, and it doesn't even have to be poor like a 2012 type heat, but if we have a 2019 or 2020, 20 in particular, fade to the crop because August takes the wherever potentially we are right now off the top of it, it's going to get really dynamic, because if you look at the disparity between old crop basis, which is still record high in a lot of places, and where new crop prices are, there is a disconnect there that if we don't finish with a great crop, may get wider before it gets narrower.
You know, you bring a great point. You know, the weather here is certainly a huge impact here in the United States. We can see it. We're all living it, right? It's in front of us. But it's also impacting the other parts of the world. You mentioned Europe. Boy, they're getting hit hard with some heat as well. And then you throw, the Ukrainian piece over there. Boy, there's just a lot of information just all over the board. And I guess we just got to continue to battle it out here for the next, several months until harvest starts to happen. But coming up this week is another big report coming from the federal government. Jody, tell us about this upcoming notice that we're going to get.
Well, the Federal Reserve comes out Thursday with what their next rate increase is going to be. And the market has priced in, and judging by how they have the speeches they've made and the news that they've put out internally, it looks like they're going to raise it another 0.75 of a point. So that's unprecedented in our lifetime, and I think you can go back even further. It's maybe unprecedented in the history of the Federal Reserve in consecutive meetings to go 0.75 of a point, and we're sitting 1.5 points higher on borrowing money, even for the really, really good customers, minimum than where we were just 3 months ago. And if they come in and stay with 0.75 of a point and do not give any indication that they're ready to choke the life out of this market and out of inflation by raising it potentially another 0.75 of a point before we get to the end of the year, if we can get past the recessionary talk our markets are going to be in great shape, because what has happened, and this affects directly U.S. exports because it directly affects the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar has pulled back about 3% since the height of the, I guess you'd call it mania about how far can the Fed raise rates and keep us out of a recession. And if they can engineer some sort of a soft landing to the economy so that we stay out of a recession and employment stays good, then the dollar will continue to fall and people will have jobs and they'll have money. The rest of the world will be able to afford our goods because, as we've spoken about before, the dollar at this record level is 20% above last year. And even if the price of corn had not changed, that means that Mexico, France, whoever our big buyers are, China certainly, are paying 20% more just in currency exchange. So that's an issue that we need to keep. Really, nobody wants higher rates because you don't want to have to. You don't want next year's crop loans or next year's operating line to be twice the interest expense that we had. But the plus side of that is if the dollar continues to fall and goes back to more normal levels, we're at 106.30 at today's close, back into the low to mid 90s, we could see a much better export outlook for the U.S. So that's why the Federal Reserve meeting and the repercussions from there make a really big difference this week moving forward.
A lot of very important announcements certainly ahead of us here this week as we look for the Federal Reserve to make some of those announcements. Jody, also kind of, certainly on top of mind, certainly catching a lot of headlines, is this whole area of crude oil. At the gas pumps, a lot of folks are starting to see some prices come down a little bit, feeling kind of good, but pretty good indication of really where the supply and demand's really at. But what are you picking up from your colleagues?
Well, crude oil has, from 125 got all the way back to below 90 just briefly within the last 10 days. Now you popped up about $2 a gallon today. So the price, it seems to be moderating. And more importantly, when we look at diesel, you've got diesel futures, which is heating oil on the board at NYMEX, right at about 350. And it seems to be comfortable in this 350 to 370 area. And obviously that is closer to the on-farm price than it is the price at the pump, because on-farm, you're taking a lot of layer of taxes out. So that's helpful for everybody. But there's also the other side to it that we don't need crude to collapse because of the ethanol and biodiesel demand. So you're really kind of I think the farm industry understands that higher prices of gas help them more with demand and price of corn and beans than it hurts them for what they pay extra for their diesel and gas, which is obviously we may be the only industry that has that, if you want to call it a dilemma. But,
right.
I've got nothing. I would have no problem hedging forward some fuel because we've had nearly over $1 pullback in the price of diesel on the futures. And check with your jobbers because obviously 6 weeks from now, there are going to be a whole bunch of people at the beginning of cutting some early beans or certainly some of the early variety of corn. And you'll be a lot of diesel is going to be used September, October, November. So take a look at it and see what you can line up with your local supplier, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised later on. Because if one hurricane comes into the Gulf and disrupts this, or heaven forbid, Russia creates an even bigger problem and shuts back down that Nord Stream pipeline into Europe, and Europe has got to go everywhere else except Russia for fuel. The price we know can go substantially higher, even from $95 a barrel.
Now, you bring up a great point. A lot of uncertainty ahead of us in that crude oil area, especially, although it's, 100 degrees plus in many parts across our nation right now, we're not that far off for winter and, preparing for fuel to heat our homes and so forth, not just here in the United States, but across the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to be pretty important. So keeping our eye on the ball there is going to be very important. Jody, I want to thank you for your time, for joining us here on FieldLink, and we appreciate your insight and look forward to having you in our next episode.
Thank you, Bill. Have a great afternoon.
Joining us from the Central Coast of California is Helena's Senior Product Manager, Paul Crout. Paul, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks, Bill. Awesome to be part of this process and to be on the show.
Well, Paul, you work predominantly throughout California and Arizona and in that geography. And Paul, before we deep dive into wine grapes and becoming a little bit more wise about grapes, tell us a little bit about your story. How did you get into this business?
That's a good question. It's a long story, but I didn't come from an agricultural family. I was when I was going to university, Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo. I was pre-med, and wow. I really was into science and all that, and I just kind of fell in love with agriculture during that time. Worked for a farmer-owned co-op, a farm supply company, one of the last farm supply companies, farmer-owned co-ops in California at the time, and worked in the irrigation department and really got to understand, agriculture. And I found out I didn't know what a PCA was. This is an agricultural pest control advisor, and it's basically a plant doctor. And so while I was going to school, that really, really interested me. And so I switched, kind of tracks and got away from, human health and moved into plant health. And graduated, got my agricultural pest control advisor's license, and then was a salesman consultant for that farm supply company for 12 years. So I worked in the field directly with growers for that period of time. And then after that, I moved on to the manufacturing side of the business, went to work for an organic fertilizer manufacturer. And so working with, organic nutritionals. And also at the same time, I had started my own consulting business around plant nutrition in wine grapes. Because while I was a salesman here on the Central Coast of California, I focused on the wine grape industry and working with grape growers. So did that, and then came to work for Helena in 2013 as a product manager and the agronomist for Helena on the Central Coast of California. And took a little bit of a sabbatical after about 3.5 years and went and managed wine grapes for 2 seasons, and then came back to Helena in this role. And now, as of where we are today, I'm the senior product manager in the Western Division, with responsibilities for the Central Coast and now the desert starting tomorrow. So we're very excited. So I get to touch a lot of crops. I think I touch almost 60 crops on a yearly basis, because Central Coast, we're the heart of the vegetable growing region, and we're also in the heart of wine country in California. So those are several of our the biggest crops that I deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's an interesting story, going from a medical doctor, I guess, journey to now being basically a plant doctor. Exactly.
And that's what I love about this job, and I love about plants and farming and everything there's a lot of similarities there, but plants don't talk back to you like people would. But no, really, it's something that's different. That is different every day. And I really love plant nutrition. That's kind of has become my area of expertise. And one thing that really fascinates me about wine grapes is that they respond so well to nutrition, and you can steer them in different ways, both good and bad, with nutrition and other things. So that's what really fascinates me.
Well, Paul, there's really no secret out there, but California is definitely known for its wine. And in fact, 60% of the U.S. total wine sales comes from the state of California. That Paul, that means in 3 out of 5 bottles sold in the United States comes from the region that you manage in California. Even as we're on the verge of recessions, we continue to see demand for wine and other spirits increase. Paul, what are growers in California preparing for as we see this, I guess, continued growth?
Well, it's a growth in any agricultural commodity is a good thing, and that means that we've got some job security here in California, especially on the wine side. Some of the challenges though, that we deal with in California. Number one is drought. And water availability, and so right now that's kind of the limiting factor for us in expanding potential wine grape acreage. The other thing is that there's just not a very much available acreage left to plant vineyards in ideal climatic areas. So you always hear about Napa and Sonoma. Those areas are planted out. There's really no open ground left that would reasonably, grow good quality wine grapes. The Central Coast, where I live, is getting to that point soon. So we're looking at doing it. There's a number of things that we're doing. Identifying market trends, so growing the right variety, and changing over from varieties that people might not like now that were planted years ago, and grafting over or replanting to different varieties to address the tastes of the consumers. But really, some scarcity is a good thing. Demand is a good thing. From probably 2012 through 2018, we had a glut of wine grapes. So prices were down, and there was a lot of supply out there, and so growers were struggling to make ends meet. And you would say, well, that's wine grapes, really? But really, it is a lot of growers, are barely making money there, and when the price goes down for grapes, it can be an issue. Now, luckily, we are, prices are good, demand is up, as you mentioned, and we're going full steam ahead in the industry, to produce, some of the best wines in the world. And it's great to be part of that.
I think that's really interesting. You talk about the best wines in the world, and I've had the opportunity to travel around and live around the world, and honestly, some of the best wines do come from California.
Well, we are in, the Mediterranean climate that we are in is one of, basically four that you can find in the world. There's California, there's the Mediterranean, there's South Africa, and then there's Australia. And just the combination of climate, soil, the weather, and everything makes California, one of the ideal wine growing regions in the United States and in the world. Surprisingly though, quick fact, wine grapes are grown in all 50 states in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah, and so maybe not the traditional varieties that you think about, like Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay or Zinfandel, but there are native grapes to California, and they're making hybrids, and there's actually some really good wines that are starting to come out from in other parts of the country. So it's definitely a growing trend. But being a California native, I'm kind of partial to California wines.
That's awesome. Well, Paul, for a lot of our listeners, that have not been exposed or really grown around the grape industry or the wine industry, walk us through the process for growing wine grapes. How long does it, for example, take to establish a vineyard in your part of the world?
Sure. Well, it's a very complex process. Wine grapes, they are a permanent crop. And so, when we plant a vineyard, historically, we expect that vineyard to be there for at least 30 years. Unfortunately, with a lot of pressures, and we can talk about that later, that life expectancy is going down, unfortunately. But it typically takes from planting to first, decent harvest, 3 years. So you have a 3-year commitment, of tending that crop, of growing those vines before you get an appreciable crop. Growing grapes, one thing that, especially wine grapes, one thing that people need to remember is that what we're growing, the actual wine grapes, aren't the end product. They're the raw material that is going into the end product, which is wine. And so we grow wine grapes differently, and with different objectives than, say, we do with table grapes or raisin grapes. And so we grow for chemistry, for juice chemistry, so sugar levels, pH, acidity, a big variety of factors. And so that's a little bit different from table grapes. They're very closely related, but table grapes, people want nice, perfectly big, round, flawless looking, juicy, crunchy grapes. Wine grapes are just small berries with seeds, and they're basically bags of juice. And so we don't care what they look like, because they get all crushed up and macerated and then fermented and then, and out of there. So really, simply growing grapes, there's a lot that goes into it. Most of our grapes are, irrigated. So, you have, permanent drip irrigation systems. There's trellising involved, so we have to install trellis. So it's a lot of steel in the field, a lot of land prep, and all that. Before you even plant the vine, you have to establish a level of infrastructure that that you usually don't get, in most, row crops and things of that nature. Then we get vines from the nursery. They're planted either as bare roots or green potted vines. They're all hand planted. And then, man, we start the process. Fertility, and this is where we get into talking about Grape Wise, and being Grape Wise, which is, a term, the listeners will be hearing about, but it was a kind of a concept that I came up with last year, on the tail of some of our other marketing programs. But really what Grape Wise is it's the process by which, Helena consultants operate, and kind of, it brings together the kind of the three tenets of Helena: people, products, and knowledge. Every one of those things are involved in what Grape Wise is when we go about, from planting to establishing a vineyard to growing a crop throughout the year, from an input side and from an analysis side. So people, we have smart people who understand the business, and who understand farming, as well as all the products that go along with that. And then really it's the knowledge of understanding how grapes are grown, and really understanding what the growers' objectives are, because some growers have yield objectives, other growers have quality objectives, and it's important to understand that you treat the crop differently if they, depending on what the grower's goals are. And so that's really what Grape Wise is. So it's analysis, it's sampling, it's interpretation, it's understanding the crop cycles, how the crop grows, what its nutrient sinks are, basically what fertilizers it needs at what time, a whole myriad of factors, and it takes place, year after year after year, throughout the season. Because grapes are really cool, because they go through a very specific cycle every year. They go dormant in the winter, and we prune them, and then in the spring is bud break. So they break dormancy and they start growing. And then throughout the season, then they flower. They have blooms. That's where the grapes, they're self-pollinated, and so the grape clusters bloom. So there's bloom period, there's fruit set, and then there's berry fill, which we call berry fill. So as the berries start to grow, and then there's a period called veraison, which is a French term for berry softening. That's when the grapes turn color. And then we go through that ripening period, and then there's harvest, and then there's post-harvest, time period, and then the grapes go dormant again. So we have these very regimented times throughout the year where the Helena Grape Wise consultants, we know exactly what the vines need at those specific times, because the vines have specific nutrient requirements, specific nutrient sinks at those specific times. And so we tailor our prescriptive fertility programs based on the knowledge of what those sinks are, as we move through the season in our Grape Wise program. So.
Wow, Paul, just listening to the process of growing wine grapes, there's definitely a lot of human involvement in that. I mean, going all the way back to the grower side of prepping the fields to, you referenced hand digging the plants. And I'm assuming there's not a tremendous amount of mechanism involved here in terms of harvesting and so forth. But is it hand harvest or?
It's we talk about harvest. There are grapes. If you've ever seen grapes, we grow grapes on hillsides in rocky ground. Grapes love terrible soil. The highest quality grapes come from the worst ground, really steep hillsides, rocky ground, chalky ground. We grow table grapes and raisin grapes in nice flatland areas, and so those lend themselves a little bit more to to mechanization, at least at planting. But wine grapes, typically are planted by hand. I had the opportunity and to establish a number of vineyards when I was managing vineyards and planting vineyards, and it is a very labor intensive process. It is a crew working through with shovels, hand digging the holes at the different spaces and hand planting them. And then as we go through hand tending the grapes with pruning, with training the vines up onto the trellis. And then there's a number of practices that we do during the year, either with shoot thinning, so removing extra shoots, removing leaves to create good airflow, and then to harvest, which is in a lot of cases is done by hand. So it's a very labor intensive process. Now, in vineyards where we can do it, where it's flatter and the like, harvest can be done by machines. And the technology now is really, really good. And in fact, it used to be winemakers didn't like, premium winemakers didn't like, machine harvested fruit because the machine beat the fruit up. It would as in the process of removing the berries from the clusters, it would break them and bruise them, and they want nice, whole berries that aren't broken. And so the technology has gotten so good now that the machines harvest just as cleanly as hand crews. So that's the trend now is where we can get these machines into the vineyard, if there's nice flat even rows, the hillsides aren't too steep, is looking to machine harvest. So there is technology, but hand harvesting is probably never going to go away, because of where we grow grapes in a lot of these steep terrains.
You going back to some of the people side of things, certainly on the production side, but from the consulting side, you mentioned referenced a couple times some of the Helena professionals that are out there, assisting growers in this area. What kind of roles are the folks at Helena helping out with in terms of helping produce a better wine crop?
Well, we do we do as much or as little as the grower needs. It's certainly grower dependent, but an example of the work that I do, I as well as my salesmen and my consultants who work out here, we've all been involved in the industry for 20 years. We have a wealth of experience, both on the growing side as well as production side, wine production. So we understand not only growing grapes, but also the winemaking side, which I feel gives us a very unique perspective to other salesmen on the market, because we're really working hand in hand, partnering with the growers, understanding what their goals are, and then addressing those. But typically, what we do is we support growers from two different sides: crop protection and crop production. wine grapes get there's a number of diseases that they get, powdery mildew, botrytis, and the like. There's insect issues that we deal with, vine mealybug, mites. So our consultants or our field scouts are out in the field weekly, walking those fields, inspecting the fields to make, from a pest management perspective, making sure that those vineyards are clean, disease-free, insect-free, because you get a powdery mildew infestation or a botrytis infestation, you can lose an entire crop. I've seen entire blocks of grapes rejected because of powdery mildew on the grapes. Same thing with insects. Mealybug is a really insidious insect. It's impossible to kill. You can only really manage it, and it's a vector for viruses and other things that can basically cause a vineyard to be ripped out. Unfortunately, I've had to rip out some vineyards and recommend some vineyards be ripped out because of virus. Plants get viruses; they can't ripen a crop, and they grow and then they die early, and they go dormant early, and there's a lot of issues there. So we're out there, from a pest management side, constantly walking the vineyard and observing and scouting and making sure that the grower is and the vineyard itself is protected. And then on the crop production side, this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, and there's a little bit more art to the process, because pest management. Okay, you see a disease, you have a tool, you have a set of tools that you use to control it. With nutrition, it is a little bit more difficult, because you're dealing with soil, you're dealing with water. So what I always do as part of a Grape Wise program is we initially, especially if we're taking on a new vineyard, I take water samples. So our AquaLens water sample report that we use from Agri-Intelligence, that gives me the chemistry, the information about what's in the water. Water is the largest input in any crop, really, and because we irrigate, it's all from groundwater. So it's important to understand what's in that water, and then we take soil samples. When we're establishing a vineyard, we often do high ground for our high ground soil mapping in those blocks to establish sampling areas, so we can get a really complete picture on what's in the soil. And then once we've planted, we typically take 2 to 3 tissue samples, extractor tissue samples, over the course of the year, and that tells us what the vine is actually, the current nutritional status of the vine, at the time we take that sample. And so we take all these samples to give ourselves, to inform ourselves and to allow us to make informed decisions as to what nutrition we happen to put on. Usually the process is we take soil samples, we take water samples. I have a foundation, of what's in the bank per se, nutrient wise, and then I build a prescriptive fertility program for that block or that ranch or whatever the least common denominator is that makes sense. And I build a year-long fertility program, again, based on uptake curves or uptake, knowing what nutrients the vines are taking up at any one time. So for example, at bud break, vines are using nitrogen and calcium the most. Those are the 2 nutrients that they are using the most. And so I want to make sure that those vines have adequate nitrogen and calcium at that time of demand. That way, they're not there's no hunger there. The nutrient is not the limiting factor. And then as we move through the season at bloom, potassium becomes the most important nutrient that the vines are taking. So I time our potassium applications to just before that demand period. And so that's kind of what a prescriptive fertility program looks like. And so we build this plan with the grower. And throughout the season, as we take extractor samples, we check our work. And if things are going good, then we continue. But if things happen, as far as other deficiencies that pop up with iron or magnesium or manganese or whatever, then we adjust in season and we correct it. So it's a really flexible program, but it's important that we have a program in place, and the grower and the salesman are on the same page as far as what we're trying to accomplish. So that's kind of a decent example of what a Grape Wise fertility program looks like.
Sure. And as you kind of lay all of that out, it just really illustrates how complex this crop really is in order to develop the top quality end product that can compete on the global market and provide, the consumer the best wine available.
Exactly. And that's the goal at the end of the day.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much today for helping us become more grape wise and really educating our audience a little bit more about wine production and the vineyards in California. And we thank you for joining us today here on FieldLink.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you, Bill.
Thanks, Paul. We want to thank all of our guests today for joining us here on FieldLink, and we want to thank certainly all of our listeners. Be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms at helenaagri.com to get the latest FieldLink information and insight to help you produce a more profitable crop.